welcome to another edition of The Nation This Week, where we will be discussing trending stories locally and globally with our panel of the week. In this edition, I'm joined by Bobby VARANASI, CEO of Matryzel Consulting Inc. in the studio, and joining me via Skype is FARIDAH, HAMEED, communication coach. And let's start with what's been trending this week. But prior to that, we heard that there will be an update on the budget scheduled to be tabled on the 20th of October, but it may be held earlier. We'll let you know about that. The decision is regarded as an indication that the general election will be held soon. So stay tuned. We will update you as and when we hear more about that. But now we go back to a segment. Of course, topping the list is former Prime Minister Najib Razak. He will serve his 12-year prison sentence after the federal court on Tuesday, August 23rd, upheld the guilty verdict against him in the SRC international case. The court dismissed Najib's appeal to overturn the jail term and 210 million ringgit fine over 7 charges in the case involving funds from the former unit of 1MDB. And earlier in the day, Najib failed in his bid to recuse Chief Justice Tengku Maimun Tuan Mat from presiding over his final appeal. And this news, of course, received much reaction locally and internationally. Social media has since been flooded with comments from netizens who supported the decision and also sympathized with the former Prime Minister. And of course, fake news rears its head again. Recently, a Facebook user uploaded a photograph of a purported prison cell that appears to be filled with amenities and claimed to be reserved for VIPs. And the user claimed that the prison cells for VIPs were equipped with a television set, internet, books, air conditioning, comfortable beds and mattresses. And the prisons department has denied that the former Prime Minister is given special treatment at the Kajang prison. The department requested the public to stop speculating that there are special prison facilities for VIPs at its prison. Hence, we urge the public to stop spreading false information. Now we'll go on to the topic of conversation. We'll bring FARIDAH in to comment because she has something that's related to it. FARIDAH, your topic for this week, perhaps you can share that with us.
So today I'm going to be talking about the most historic verdict that so far probably in our lifetime at the moment. This is the closure of the SRC case, and I'm not going to go into the legal aspects so much, but the point I want to make that was the most important for me, and I believe for many, many Malaysians, was the demonstration of the independence of the judiciary. I think that, to me, in a lot of the social media that I've been looking at, is what has come through. Despite all the high emotions and the people on different sides of the political divide, what we have seen actually is the reinforcement that the judiciary is independent. And I'd like to make this point, which I think we all need to remember. Article 8 of our federal constitution says that all people are equal before the law and entitled to equal protection of the law. So we have to remember the federal constitution is not just, articles and a lot of words on, in a book. These are the governing principles and the guiding framework on which our nation operates. If I had my way, honestly, I think the federal constitution should be a subject that should be taught in all universities in the country, because it shouldn't just be under the law faculty, because we as Malaysians need to understand what our federal constitution is about, and for the younger generation to understand that there are all these checks and balances in place. Having said that, I also would like to quote the late Lord President of Malaysia, Tun Saleh Abbas, who was dismissed in a constitutional crisis in 1998. And I think it bears repeating that he said that the courts are the guardian of the Constitution. So let us remember there were 9 judges in the course of this 4-year trial who presided over this court case. So you had the High Court, which was Judge Muhammad Nazlan, who was the one who handed out the sentence of 12 years and the 210 million ringgit fine. And then the case went to the Apex or Appeals Court, where there were 3 judges. And then to the Federal Court, where there were 5 judges. So a total of 9 judges. And at the High Court, the judgment that Judge Muhammad Nazlan handed down, the written judgment, is 801 pages. The apex court with the 3 judges was a 317-page document of a written judgment, and the federal court, we are still waiting for the written judgment. So when you take all of that into consideration, 4 years, 9 judges, thousands of pages of written judgment, what this will become is a case study, I don't think just for Malaysia, but I think for the entire Commonwealth on a case of this magnitude. So the courts have given us comfort in this particular case that no one is above the law. And I know sometimes, we all kind of snigger at that because we see many cases of the double standards in the law. And as you mentioned, Elane, just now, there's all this noise on social media about the special treatment that may be given to Najib. And the law is not perfect. But I think in this particular case with the judiciary, it is very important because the judiciary is the cornerstone of a functioning democracy.
I think we'll have Bobby comment on your take on this as well.
Yep, sure. Hi, good afternoon. I think primarily judicial independence, absolutely. And it has nothing to do with the publicity around a certain case or its magnitude of impact on a nation. Even the smallest of petty cases through to a case of disorder. A consistent approach towards application of the legal principles under the governance of the Constitution, which is the document that drives the justice component, right? Law and justice are not necessarily equal. I think that has been a constant challenge across much of the democratic world is law equal to justice? It actually, in most cases, may not be. So justice typically is a perception, whereas the law is the law of the land.
Right.
When they both come together, you can see that the responsible judiciary is very highly functioning. It may be fallible, but it doesn't necessarily mean you reject it, right?
Right.
So there are many more cases to go, especially with the former Prime Minister Najib himself. This is just the tip of the iceberg, right?
But it's a great start.
It's a great start, absolutely. And I think that should continue. So the trust in the judicial system is more important than measuring it by virtue of 1 or 2 individual cases.
Yeah, and I'd like to bring up what Faridah mentioned earlier with regards to the federal constitution having sort of like visibility as a sort of like an education. Everyone should know about it. I think you were also nodding alongside maybe your comments on that. Yeah,
see, we don't necessarily understand Constitution at all outside of political science courses, in the graduate level.
Yeah.
People know what a constitution is, but never seen one.
Yeah.
And this is true of much of the world. It's not unique to Malaysia. What we need is, yes, an education, but more important to understanding and reading the constitutional principles and clauses, which is, it's very verbose, and it is not necessarily, a language for the common man.
Right.
It needs to be translated. And how is it applied? People need to see the application of the Constitution at work.
Right.
This is where I come back to the point of law and justice. Your Constitution is clear in Article 8. So the big question that somebody asks is, then what about the new economic model? Is it antithetical to the Constitution when it was set up so many years ago as privileged benefits to a certain set of people? Now, should we justify it, or should we say that it is an interim measure? Are they counterintuitive, or do they complement one another?
Right.
These conversations need to come into the mainstream.
Right.
And only then we can start making sense of the larger application around it.
We'll have to hold that thought. We have to take a short breather. When we come back, we'll discuss it a little bit further. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after these messages. Hello and welcome back on The Nation This Week with me, Elane, Noor, Abdullah. In the studio sitting with me is, of course, Bobby Varanasi, CEO of Matryzel Consulting Inc. And later on, we'll try to get Faridah back online on Skype, the communication coach. We were speaking, of course, earlier about the Najib's case, and you had a thought earlier with regards to the law and the justice and federal constitution. Perhaps you want to elaborate on that a little bit further.
Yeah. See, in principle, the Constitution is a guidance document, right? Its application is manifested in the laws of the land, right? So we have to, if we have to understand and appreciate how a Constitution is an all-encompassing document, you have to look at each of the laws of the land. Do they apply in the context of do they address all the aspects of every single article in the Constitution?
But you were saying earlier with regards to some things may be counterintuitive.
They're perceived as counterintuitive. So there is, a Constitution is about the governance of a nation. Again, it's a pretty wide-ranging document. It is not infallible in the way it is structured. If you look at today US and people questioning the right to bear arms.
Right.
And its consequences. So there is that constant battle, right?
So the question of evolution, is that part of it?
Absolutely. It is part of it. So now, in that context, the point I was making earlier about NEP may come to play to say, in the context of development, it was a necessary
at that point
step
of time.
at that point. And as we get to that point with those goals, then yeah, you can probably wean away from it. And like where I come from in India, we have the same problem. Our articles, our constitution is almost exactly the same as yours. And we have a similar challenge when it comes to special rights for castes and tribes and all. And the same battle has been raging for 75 years now. So it's a development, but the laws do not necessarily contradict the Constitution. But do we understand the Constitution's largest in the first place?
Right. No, I think it's about time that we re-examine what is priority and what can evolve. I think a lot of times I have this perception that people think that then it's set in stone and therefore it cannot be re-looked at, reviewed as and when the time changes.
It can be reviewed, see, but you know, tampering with a Constitution that has been extremely well thought out needs consent. It needs a majority consent that everybody is able to take a view to a 50-year future. It is not an immediate future like a balance sheet. And that is why people don't tamper with constitutions. And we have had very bad examples. Whole of the African continent we have seen. People who have tampered with constitutions have destroyed their economies.
Right. We are back online with FARIDAH on call because I think there was a little bit of technical issues with Skype. But I wanted to introduce another topic of conversation for now. Another trending story, of course, Bobby, medical cannabis. KJ says Malaysia is keen to learn more about medical cannabis, learn about cannabis from Thailand. And he was briefed on the medical cannabis policy in Thailand, including the practices, cultivation methods, research, and the use of cannabis and ketum for health purposes. He also assured that the government will not allow recreational use of cannabis in Malaysia. Clearly, according to the pain management specialists and those dealing with psychiatry, we need to move into this space at some stage. And on June 9th, Thailand became the first Southeast Asian country to legalize the cultivation and possession of medical cannabis. This is considered a step forward in the right direction, demonstrating that Malaysia is on the path of medical evolution. I was speaking about evolution, right, Bobby? So this is part of it. So let's have your thoughts on this before I throw back to FARIDAH.
Ingredients per se have, most of them, right, in history have come from nature.
Yes, that's right.
And of course, with progress in science and technology, we have been able to build a lot of compounds and molecules by mixing and matching them, right? So if you go back to tracing and making the argument that cannabis is bad, then how many ingredients in every single, blood pressure pill that I take or the headache pill that you take are actually considered in isolation, illegal? They could almost all of them could be illegal.
Yeah.
So it is not necessarily about medical cannabis today, and tomorrow we could be starting, we could start thinking of hemp. Why not use hemp? So there are many applications, right? The point is there going to be responsible governance so that we don't lead an economy down an incorrect path where people may lose more than they gain.
Right.
So the enforcement is going to be critical. The policy, absolutely, but its enforcement mechanism, how is that going to come to play?
So those are the questions at this point of time. Now, FARIDAH, can you hear us? Perhaps we'd like to get your view with regards to this topic of medical cannabis.
Yeah.
We can't hear her. FARIDAH?
Can you hear me?
Slightly louder, yeah. Now we can hear you a little bit.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Some technical issues.
Yes.
Yeah, adding on to the point that Bobby made, Thailand actually is the first country in Asia to decriminalize the plant for industrial, medical and personal use. And we all know Kyrie has been there because he's been looking at all the opportunities that are possible. In 2022, actually just a couple of months ago, the Thai government removed marijuana and hemp from the narcotic list. And the truth is that this is where everywhere in the world we are moving to, particularly for palliative care, for chemotherapy, for a bunch of other autoimmune diseases and such. So I think we've spoken about this in one of the other shows, and I am all for it, because I think if we can have a natural variation to chemical medication, I think that's always a good thing, because it's going to have less effect on the body.
Yeah, that's right. No, I think a lot of this is something that you mentioned as well, in terms of it's from nature. So it's a question of how we use it and not abuse it at the point at the end of the day. Now, Bobby, I'd like to go to your topic of conversation this week. Perhaps you start with your first one.
Yeah. So we're talking about awareness of carbon, the mechanism and credit. I know that Malaysia has been doing a lot of work, but it has been hidden in the corners somewhere in small government offices. Not many people understand it and appreciate it. We have had institutions like KETA and the Green Tech Ministry were set up a few years ago. Then we had CEDA coming on board. But none of their work has actually been mainstreamed out. Meanwhile, Malaysia has promised to the world about its own reduction strategies, right? It's supposed to reduce carbon emissions by 40% by 2020. We are sitting at 34% now. So slightly off the mark, but I guess you could always blame it on the pandemic for that, right? We are supposed to be net zero by 2050 and about 45% by the end of 2030.
Right.
How are we going to get there?
Yes.
The three broad things that the government has adopted, which I believe are necessary or insufficient arguments, is one is about land use and forestry. So there's a significant amount of what you call reclassification of land as being only forest land, so that you don't replace them with plantations or palm oil. And that can actually sequester carbon a lot more. So there's a lot of, they're called carbon sinks. And let me give you the numbers, these are startling. So Malaysia did the calculation, I think in 2021. The net per capita emission of carbon by Malaysians, so each one of you, me, all of us, is about 1 million tons every year. But if you take the sinking of the carbon from the forestry land, especially Sabah and Sarawak are the leaders in the massive amount of forestry, it's 9.94 million tons. So
what does that translate to?
It's 9 times the difference if you maintain forestry.
Right.
A significant amount of reduction in carbon, you need to maintain forestry.
Right.
So one of the rules that came forward was, okay, let's make it tougher for people to open up plantations. And that's where you have seen the CPS, or the responsible palm oil production policies, came into play. But all of these have been geared at incentivizing companies, right? And especially certain sectors only. But the manufacturing sector is the biggest producer of carbon.
Right.
We haven't done anything much.
Right.
Unfortunately, the incentive policies have not been taken up because solar doesn't work, biogas is only limited to Sarawak, and now we are struggling with our targets. We won't get there.
Now, of course, I want to talk a little bit more about how we're going to manage this, because we're sort of like bringing up the problems, but we need to find a solution. I have to take a short breather right now. When we come back, let's discuss that a little bit more. Stay tuned, we'll be right back. Hello, thanks for staying with me, Elane, Abdullah, on The Nation This Week. In the studio, Bobby Varanasi, CEO of Matryzel Consulting. On call is FARIDAH, HAMEED, communication coach. And we've been, of course, speaking about topics that have been trending this week. Bobby, before we went on a break, we spoke about your topic this week about carbon reduction responsibility in Malaysia and the perhaps less than impressive state of how we're doing with regards to that. But I wanted to pose a question of what's the stumbling block for us to get there? Is it profits? It
is profits. Yes, our largest producers are SMEs, 800,000+ companies, right? And they don't know what they don't know. And the discrete conversations around let's go and build in solar plants, or let's go and do biomass or biogas, all of these have been very discreet, and so the SMEs have never been a part and parcel of that conversation or even consultation. So when you impose it on them to say go and transform your businesses, they don't know where to start.
So where's the solution? What's the next step? FARIDAH, can we pull you into this conversation, FARIDAH?
So the point I have about this carbon offsets is, I remember years and years ago, there was introduction of, use polystyrene or plastic to package a lot of these electrical products. And the introduction of biodegradable packaging this is about 10 years ago, was not accepted by the industry simply because it was considered too expensive. And the reason I highlight this is because it's always going to be a cost issue.
Exactly.
And so the government, I believe, has to come up with some kind of offset, tax offsets or credits. I'm not sure whether there's anything currently in place, but I think it's always going to be that's going to make people want to change or to enforce it. And with SMEs, as Bobby rightly pointed out, they make up the bulk of the industries in the country. And if with just coming out of COVID, this is not something that probably is high on their priority list. So the government needs to make it doable for them.
So the question is are there incentives? You said that there are?
There are incentives that are administered by SEDA, which is the Sustainable Energy Development Authority. Unfortunately, it's focused only on the energy piece. The plastics, the other biodegradable components, those are not an inclusive factor. Let me give you a simple example. In India, there are 33,700 kilometers of roads made only of plastic. There is no tar, no coal, no carbon emissions at all. How did it happen? Where did the plastic come from? And it takes approximately 1 ton of waste plastic to build 1 kilometer of a road.
Right. So
it's coming from the ecosystem.
So you're saying that there's an opportunity for us to be able to reuse, reduce, in order for us to be able to bring it back into the economy.
And the second part, which Malaysia has not yet done, I think that's the point Faridah was making, was you have to have an incentive which is a carrot, but there has to be a stick. An incentive can be money for investments in the new technologies, or it can be some level of offsets with bank loans and all. But I also need to give you tax holidays for investing. I'll give you a lesser tax burden.
Right.
But if you don't invest, I'll increase your tax. There is the stick approach as well, and that's the only way it works.
Punitive, right?
It has to be a combination of both.
There's always a punishment and reward sort of system that sort of drives us and motivates us to get to the point that we want people to get to. Now we're running out of time. I'd love to be able to talk about some of the other topics that we had on the list, which includes the gender responsive budget, but I think that's for another day. For now, that's all the time that we have on The Nation this week. Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, Faridah, online as well. We were in conversation with communication coach Faridah HAMEED and Bobby VARANASI, CEO of Matryzel Consulting Inc. I'm Elane. See you next Friday. Have a great weekend. Bye for now.